report to him in 60 days what they can change about the current procedures. And they have also set up a committee, I think it's called DPC or something like that. The idea is that they're going to get together across various departments and try to streamline everything in immigration law. And that should help. And that brings me to the next point, which is the biggest pain point for most students right now. I have sent in for my OPT. I have sent in for my STEM extension. My checks are not cashed. What do I do? This is a known issue. Everybody knows all lockboxes are having a problem. Some more than others, like Texas lockbox. It looks like nobody's home. People keep knocking, but it is what it is. We are dealing with it. American Immigration Lawyers Association, I'm not very actively involved, but I know they do good work. They go in, they knock doors. Similarly, various associations like NAFSA, which is the National Association of Foreign Student Advisors, good resource actually. They are also following up, and individual DSOs, designated school officials, who are your mouthpiece for the USCIS as well as for the school, they are also following up. The last recommendation I saw was that if your OPT has been pending 115 days, you should contact your DSO. They'll try to knock some more doors. So 115 days seems to be the magic number for some reason. Now, what do we do in the meantime? And I have been on LinkedIn, I was posting about this yesterday, and looks like a lot of people are affected by this. So I said, look, there are two different periods of optional practical training. You've got the first year OPT, which is like a walk in the park. Very few rules. You can jump around, run around, romp around. As long as you are working 20 hours each week, paid or unpaid. So even if you reached out to, let's say you reached out to Disha and you said, Disha, I am a DBA. Do you have a database as a nonprofit? Do you have a database that needs building or that needs administration? I can volunteer 20 hours each week. That's good enough. And Disha can send you a document saying that you will work no less than 20 hours a week, and she'll certify it only when she's convinced of it. So that's good enough. But when you come to the second part, the OPT extension, STEM OPT extension, you need paid employment, no less than 20 hours each week. But here's the problem. There are two issues, two pain points here. People who have submitted their STEM extensions, the grace period is 180 days, I think. If that's expiring, they can't continue working. What should they be doing? So what I've told these folks is, let's utilize the best of the two worlds. Start volunteering your time. Don't take any benefits and don't take any money. If we ever go to court over this, we can then tell the judge that, look, Your Honor, we complied with the laws as best as we could. We worked and we didn't get paid for it. If you don't get paid for it and you get no benefits out of it, it is not unauthorized employment. But at the same time, my OPT required 20 hours. I fulfilled the 20 hours. So what do you want me to do? If the government won't budge and they won't follow reasonable procedures and timelines, this is the best I can do. So start working even if it is 20 hours and continue doing that. The last pain point that I was going to talk about is, and I think somebody was typing that in as I was looking, Dishaji, that I have sent in my package for STEM extension, and I've got no receipts. My checks have not been cashed. I think there is a particular regulation that requires the government to actually encash checks within 3 business days. So there's a lawsuit right there because they have to follow their own regulations. Courts are very tough about that. Now, there are, of course, counter arguments to that from the government as well. But I'm saying there are actually rules about this. The equally important is the rule, I believe it's 103.2. Just remember these alphabets. 8 CFR, Code of Federal Regulations. So the Code of Federal Regulations contains our entire regulatory framework for immigration law. And you can find it online. And it's not difficult to read because you're already in the process, you know the terms. So when you go to 8 CFR, and I think it's 214, if you go to 8 CFR 214.2, underneath section F, F is F1 visa, student visa, section F is student visa, section H is H1 visa. So actually the sections follow the visas. You can read up on it. It's not difficult to read. It's a good idea to know what the law is. Under 8 CFR 103.2, I think, filing of an application is complete when the government physically receives the application fully signed and with the proper fees. So my advice to people, you have filed it. If they haven't cashed the checks, that's their problem. If you have proof of delivery, continue working. Okay, so I don't see any problem with that. I think government is not going to come after us for up until 180 days, you can continue doing that. After 180 days, shift to the 20 hours unpaid mode until we get this resolved. Is that, Disha, did I just give a lot of words, no information?
No, I'm just going to sort of repeat what you said to see if everyone's understood correctly. Is that for those that have filed their STEM extension, so the 180-day automatic extension that you do get, you should proceed with the assumption that once your application has been submitted and you've gotten positive affirmation saying we've received your application, irrespective of whether that fees has been encashed or not, on your end.
That's the problem. They're not getting the affirmation, the receipt.
Yes,
all you can have is the proof of delivery, and that's good enough.
So the postage proof that you have, because I'm sure you sent it by registered post. So you're saying that itself is good enough for you to continue at least for the 180-day period. And beyond that,
it's the proof of delivery, not just postage. See, remember in contracts, we have the mailbox rule. If you have mailed the application, no, it has to be actually received. So if you've sent it Federal Express, there should be proof of delivery. As long as you have proof of delivery, that's as good as a receipt. Keep going.
Okay. So that's as good as a receipt, but again, that is limited to your 180-day period. Should you not hear back in that 180-day period, just to be on the safer side of things, switch to voluntary work instead, so that when you do get approved, you can, go back and resume work and say that as far as procedure goes, we followed every step that there is, and there's been no lapse on our end. So
you must be a lawyer or something.
I am a lawyer.
Well said. Well said. Absolutely. And this is the first time I have needed somebody to translate my English.
No, just making sure, because I see a lot of questions in the chat box are around this STEM extension, and I'm guessing a lot of people are facing the same issue. But I'm just going to rewind a little, because there are a couple of questions about the OPT itself.
Right.
So I think, and this is for people who are relatively early in their stages of degrees. So if you could just talk a little bit about the OPT and what applying for it constitutes, and what are the do's and don'ts in terms of traveling outside or back to your home country. What is the time frame you should keep in mind before you decide to do those things?
There's a whole lot of rules about OPT. Some of them are counterintuitive. I would not be able to go through all the rules, nor do I remember them off the top of my head. There are so many of them. But I can tell you this, the information is out there. All the information that you need is on Google itself. But the only problem is, which information can you trust? So I'll tell you my secret, my dirty little secret, and I will insist that you don't reveal it to others, because then the mystique of wisdom and knowledge goes away. When I need information, I actually go to one of the Ivy League DSO's websites. And then I go to NAFSA. And then I look at the regulations. So you have all the three resources. Go to one of the Ivy League websites, look at what they say, what are they recommending to the students. Look at what NAFSA says, if they have something else to add, and then look at the regulation. If it completely doesn't make sense, then call Rajiv or email Rajiv. And my email is help@immigration.com. I'll do the best I can. I've been inundated with these same questions, but I'm trying my very best. And along with keeping my day job, I am answering all the questions that I can. Okay, don't worry so much. It's all going to work out. These are temporary labor pains of delivery of a new administration. We'll be okay. but follow these procedures that we are telling you. Now, what exactly is an OPT and how does that figure into the grand scheme of things? Optional practical training is a 1-year work permission. It's considered to be practical training given to everyone who is doing a degree course after they have been in full status for at least 2 prior full semesters. Okay, so most people take it upon post completion. There are different flavors of it. There is some pre-completion OPT, but if you take it, it'll be deducted from your 1 year. There's a CPT, another, that's an essay I can write because that's a lawsuit waiting to happen. And these guys are going to get so banged up in court. I feel sad for them because they have done such a hash with CPT. We'll talk about that if necessary, but let me cover the OPT. One quick aside that I was speaking at IT Serve Alliance a couple of months ago, and they said, talk about immigration law. And I said, that's like asking a Pandit to talk about the Gita, or a Maulvi to talk about the Quran, or a priest to talk about Bible. I mean, where do you begin, where do you end? There's so much to say. It's the same thing with even student visa matters. So much to say. But OPT is given, you've got 1 year. You are required to work at least 20 hours, paid or unpaid. Then you get into STEM extension, which is for science, technology, engineering, mathematics students. You get 2 more years to work. Each year, you keep trying to get your H-1B. That's the general worldview of the student life.
Correct, and absolutely right. I think like there's so much information out there which really does fuel all these anxieties, and given that you come from a different country, you always feel like, you know, you have to tread even more cautiously when interacting with all of these laws.
I have to tell you something. I have to share it before you go forward because this happened yesterday. Somebody was talking to me on LinkedIn and she said, how come you're so sympathetic towards students? And I said, saas bhi kabhi bahu thi. I was a student. I went on to OPT, H-1B, did my own green card. So I know exactly how you feel, you guys. It's okay. You're all right.
And just in terms of like the OPT and the working requirements under it, because I see a couple of questions on that as well, is that, like you said, it's to maintain your status, it is you're doing minimum 20 hours of work, and be it paid or unpaid, that's irrelevant to maintain your status. But say someone was to take up employment for 2 people and be working more than 40 hours a week, what are the repercussions of that on your visa status?
No problem at all. Work 40, work 60, work 80 hours. In fact, the first year of OPT, you could even set up your own business if you want. Okay, but somebody has to monitor your hours. So your business partner or somebody has to monitor your hours. Other than that, even USCIS says it's okay.
Okay. And again, with the OPT, there's the whole process, and I'm sure like all of the universities that you're going to run you through it because they're the ones that are, you know, putting in your documents and sponsoring that additional visa. But the distinction between the OPT and the H-1B, which is so important, is that the OPT is only available when you, like you said, been an actively present student for 2 consecutive semesters, whereas the H-1B is more of a sponsorship for work visa that does not necessarily require you to be in the United States for a degree to find employment here.
It's like trying to compare a puppy and a horse. They're just 2 different beasts. And really, H-1B is the horse of work visas because you can do a lot more, but you are also constrained. It also is for a much longer duration and allows you to start your green card. F1 student visas don't allow you to have immigrant intent normally. So therefore, it's difficult to compare H-1Bs and F1s. But for your purposes for now, you need a professional degree, you need a professional job. It needs to be paid a certain amount. What is that amount? Go to flcdatacenter.com. F as in foreign, L as in labor, C as in certification. Data center is spelled the American way, not the Indian way. CENTER, flcdatacenter.com. Look at the wages. You have wages for the entire country for all the jobs, depending upon the state and the county you work in. Level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4. There'll be 4 levels of jobs Most students will go with level 1 entry-level jobs. Level 2 would be more competent people. Level 3 will be advanced, and level 4 be almost technically the leadership kind of positions, or doing new things in technology, or whatever your field is. So flcdatacenter.com is the Department of Labor website that tells you the prevailing wages for the entire country. So H-1B requires a degree, a professional job, it requires the right wages, and then a lot of luck so that you can get through the lottery. Why the heck there is a lottery? Because there are more people than there are visas. Mr. Biden said he doesn't like the idea of a lottery. He says that market forces should decide how many visas we need. And that's how it used to be before we got into a fight on the Hill, and the fancy numbers were spun up and nobody knows the reason for them. And these numbers were decided a good 15 years back. Okay, so that's what an H-1B visa is. It allows you to file a green card, good for 6 years. And once you file your green card, you can keep extending it beyond 6 years. I'm making it very simple, just enough information to give you bite-sized chunks.
No, that's absolutely great. I think it's just to get a sense of clarity, and that's the most important thing. And I'm actually going to move on to a topic that seems to be like a recurring concern, which is travel when it comes to like what is permissible or what is least risky in terms of traveling, either when you're in a pending state, like your application for OPT or H-1B is pending, or you've gotten the visa. So first, to start with, when you've applied for OPT, or and you haven't received the employment authorization card, or your H-1B hasn't been approved, travel to home countries seems to be something that people are very concerned about. How safe is it? Like, are they going to face any troubles coming back in on the immigration front, or should they wait to get approved and actually have their physical copies of the EADs in hand before they do decide to travel back and forth?
I actually don't remember what happens when the OPT application is still pending. I gave somebody a link this morning. If you go to dhs.gov/ICE, or is it ice.gov/SEVP, they have a frequently asked questions. And all these issues are in such detail, discussed completely. So just Google, I would say, frequently asked questions OPT, and space site, the word site, colon, without space, .gov. So you are looking for only .gov information. It pulls up right away. I do this almost every day. So I don't remember exactly how that works, but when you are taking a break during the middle of your OPT, remember you have a limited number of days you can be off work. Those days get counted towards that. And also when you come back, remember you've got to have a visa. So you make sure you have a current visa. Or before you go, make sure you get your I-20 endorsed for international travel. That's required. So you've got to go to your DSO and ask them to approve you for international travel. Have your visa, and make sure you have proof that you have been working and you will continue working. So that's when your papers are already approved. If you still need that information, you're not able to find, just send me an email to help@immigration.com. Actually, I'll create a separate section on immigration.com for just you guys. So don't worry about that. Just let me know. We'll fix it for you.
Thank you. And I am currently on an OPT visa, so I can speak to this a little bit. Is that so they give you a 90-day window within which they tell you whether or not they'll approve your application, and then within that year you again get a 90-day period of going without employment. That's acceptable. Otherwise, like once that expires, your visa status is no longer maintainable. And once you do get your EAD physically, and as long as you're carrying that on you along with your new I-20, I know travel is not a problem, but I think the major question is in that intervening period between the I have submitted my application versus I've actually gotten my authorization card in hand. That 90 or more day window is the one that confuses people a lot in terms of, should I be traveling to my home country, or can I take a little holiday and exit the country, or is that going to have larger repercussions? Because say, should something go wrong, or should they need you to correct something about your application, your absence from the US, could that be detrimental to your application?
Actually, there's a bigger problem. What happens is, normally when you leave, when an application is pending, the application is deemed abandoned. So I'll give you this information in 2 seconds. I just I was just looking at it this morning, actually. So you need you can travel. One second. This is just echoing what I was talking about. You need your job offer letter, work contract. With the pending application, if your current EAD has expired, do not travel while your STEM OPT extension is pending. These are notes from conversation with USCIS. So when the STEM extension is pending, they are saying do not travel. How about when the first year is pending? I can find that out for you guys. I don't have the information right now in front of me. See, we never used to have to get involved with student issues. It's something new that has happened in the last 5-6 years. Because the DSOs knew a lot more than we did, they called us in only when something was about interpretation of regulations, or for example, a reinstatement was involved. That's where you needed lawyers. For these routine issues, we never used to get involved. But I'm having to learn all this all over again, simply because the DSOs are as confused as the rest of the world. So I'll find out the information. Send me an email if you don't have it, help@immigration.com. I'll tweet it out. I'll send it to you guys. I will also put it on LinkedIn.
Thank you. I'm going to transition to similar questions, but more focused now on the H-1B, not so much the OPT. Again, that process between, having applied for H-1B and your STEM extension, similar queries about traveling back to India in that intervening period, and if you could walk us through what the H-1B lottery process is, because I think it's a very confusing for first-time applicants. It's a very confusing system to just understand, not so much navigate, but just like what goes on.
Okay. Now this is where our specialty comes in, because this is what we do. So once you're out of school, that's when you come to us, and that's where we take over any H-1B green card types of issues. So the way this works is, first of all, this year and the year before, lottery was based upon first an electronic registration, where you just need basic information about the employee, the job, employer, and then they put you through the lottery. And I think they started on March 1st and they continue till March 21st, something like that. 21 days is required by law. So they have to open a 21-day windows to submit applications. After they do, as you are selected, it will start showing online, selected. And at that point, you have X number of days. I don't remember how many, X number of days. I think it's 60 that you get to prepare your application and file it. Okay. Now, it's been asked, this is a question that is asked more frequently than I like. What if my degree is not yet finished when I apply for my electronic registration, but it will be finished by the time I apply for my H-1B? And the answer is that's okay. You don't have to have the degree finished when you apply for the registration, but you've got to have it finished when you apply for the H-1B. Now, travel. Travel can be tricky. Remember, I told you that if you leave the United States when an application is pending, the application is deemed abandoned. In the H-1B context, there are actually two sub-applications. One is for the H-1B status, which requires you to be in the United States. And the other one is for the H-1B eligibility, where you can take the H-1B approval and go get a visa stamp and come back. So if you had to travel when the H-1B was pending, be prepared to do one of the two things. If your OPT is still valid, you can come back on the OPT. But if the H-1B was not approved when you left, and it's either still pending when you come back, well, it's still pending, you should be okay. But no, you wouldn't be. I take that back. So if you travel while the H-1B is still pending, you've got to have OPT to come back. Otherwise, wait outside, get the H-1B approval, get the H-1B stamp, and you can come back 10 days before October 1st, because that's the start date of the fiscal year. Okay, you can't come more than 10 days before the start date of your H-1B. Okay, now, so once again, let's take it back. Can you travel while the H-1 is pending? Yes, but you might have to jump through additional hoops. Now, what if the H-1B is approved in your absence and you're en route or you're coming back? You can still come back on your F-1 if the OPT is still valid and it's not October 1st yet, because your OPT is still valid, you can come back. But then to activate the H-1B, you would either have to go outside the United States and get a visa stamp or apply for a change of status. There's another practical problem with this. The practical problem is that the school, once they hear of the change of status, will deactivate your service. So you got to go back and tell them to put a data fix that I'm not doing my H1B right now, put me back in F1, and that's not difficult to do. Okay, so that's the travel. Now, what about where it's not October 1st yet, your H1B is approved, can you travel? And the answer is yes, because even if you travel, as long as you come back before October 1st and your OPT is still valid, again, data fix is needed. Make sure that they have not taken you off the service numbers. When you come back, October 1st, automatically you become H1. What happened here? That you came back before October 1st, or whatever the date your H1B kicks off, that's when the H1B automatically comes into play. In the other two scenarios, the H1B was not yet approved. Okay, so let's sum it up. When it's a lot of information, when you travel after H1B is approved, but before October 1st return back, you're fine, as long as your OPT is still valid. If you travel when your H1B is pending and you still have OPT and you can come back on OPT, you will have to do additional steps to convert to H1B. And if you don't have OPT, stay outside, wait for the H1B and come back with an H1B visa.
So it truly depends on what status you're currently holding, and that will determine how much and for what period you can travel.
Talk to a lawyer before you go.
Yeah. I'm just going to say this out loud for anyone who still needs any clarifications, because I did see quite a few questions about the whole travel when H1B is pending / approved.
I'll find out for you.
Yeah, please use the question and answer box if you have any follow-up questions. And okay, I'm going to move like in the next logical progression, which is the green card, transitioning to that. So a couple of questions about at what stage on your H1B can you actually start the procedure for applying for a green card? And like, should it be as soon as you get your H1B approval, or should it be a little while into you working on that visa status? How does that process work? Like,
you don't even have to be employed with the employer who starts your green card. A lot of people know that. So carrying that further, that means there really is no cooling off period. You could start your H1B and green card the same day. You could start the green card before the H1B, and you could start the green card after the H1B. Each has its own repercussions, but anything is possible, because green card is a job which is projected in the future. So when I file a green card for an employee, a staff member, a team member, I'm projecting my mind X number of years in the future. X used to be 6 months when I got my green card. Now X is 13 years or 14 years or 15 years. So I'm projecting my mind that far in the future and saying, well, in X number of years, this is the job I'll offer you. So for example, technically you could be a systems developer with me, but I'm going to offer you a job as a systems manager, because in 10 years, I think that's where you're going to be. So because it's a job in the future, you can actually start it even when you're in India. But the problem is certain visas don't allow you to have the intention to immigrate to the United States. And a lot of you know that. That's the immigrant intent. The 214B denials you see all the time, that's basically, oh, we don't believe you that you're going to come back. Well, none of us is going to come back. That's a legal fiction. The important question is, would I break the laws? And that's the important question. Nevertheless, that's called dual intent, where you have the green card intention, but you're allowed to come in. H1B, H4, L1, L2 are allowed to have, O1 are allowed to have this intention. But F1, tourist visa, J1 are not allowed to have. Nevertheless, when I came to this country, I had a green card pending for me. I was still allowed a student visa because I told the consular officer, I am a lawyer, I know the laws, I never break them, I will not work at a 7-Eleven, I have a job, a very good job. So therefore, you could potentially get a student visa, and then people do all the time when the green card is still pending under different circumstances. Okay, so H1B and green card, when can green card be started? Anytime.
And so it doesn't have to be that you're formally employed or your H1B employment is actually kicked in. The minute you're approved, you say that you can actually start, or even before, like once you've applied for H1B, simultaneously you can also start the process for your green card.
simultaneously or
Or-
even precursively before you, no problem at all.
And another quick question about the H-1B, Rajiv ji, is for first-time sponsors, so people who are currently on OPT and have had the conversation with their current employers, who are willing to sponsor them, what sort of information should they be keeping tabs on for both the student that is looking to get an H-1B sponsorship and also for a first-time person sponsoring uh, an international student for an H-1B?
You're talking about the employer's perspective.
Both the student. I mean, you've more or
Well,
less covered what the student should be looking out for when applying for an H-1B, but what would it look like for a first time sponsor? Like,
okay.
are there any eligibility requirements they need to meet to
No,
be
no,
able to?
no. They just have to have intestinal fortitude for BS. Okay. The employer has to be able to put up with a very highly artificial, highly choreographed regulatory environment where nothing makes sense, but it's got to be done that way. And normally, when we have a first conversation with a new employer, we break them into the process with the most important things that they need to know. Information should always be provided in a pyramid format. Begin what with at least what you need to know, and then go on as much as you want to. Okay. So in the same manner, if you speak with an employer, let them know there is regulatory framework, there is paperwork involved, there can be potential audits, etc. But if you do everything by the book, as lawyers says, you are safe as a babe in their cradle. So there's no problem there. But you've got to do things by the book, and the book is complicated. Okay, so that's for the H-1B side. For the green card side, we do tell them that you have to go all the way. You remember, you might have to look at resumes of people who respond, because lawyers are not allowed to do that, and you might have to prove that you have the capacity to pay, etc., etc. There are a couple of areas where usually there are problems that employers have. We bring them out in the very beginning. And what should the students look for? Number one, if you have a sleazy employer who tells you, oh, I'll run your paychecks, but I won't give you any money, get the hell out of there as quickly as you can. You're better off in the lap of Mother India than you are here in the lap of Uncle Sam. Okay, so don't stay here. Don't stay with somebody who's that sleazy. You're going to be sorry. Number two, look for an employer who wants to do things by the book and who are genuinely willing to stand up for you, because this involves work, and sometimes it can involve a lot of work. Hopefully not too much on the part of the employer, and they have to pay for some of it. So the H-1B, they have to pay the entire amount. You cannot pay out of your pocket. Attorney's fees, all filing fees, they should be paying everything. Then for green card, they have to pay, in my opinion, all the way to the I-140. By regulations, at least the first step, which is the PERM process. And if you have some extraordinary qualifications, do have them evaluated to make sure that you don't come under some of the EB1A, B, or national interest waiver categories. One point that I want to make before we go on to the next topic: how much time it's going to take depends upon your country of birth, not upon your country of citizenship. So if you're an India-born person and become a Canadian, you're still charged to India. And if you are married to somebody who's not born in India, this is called cross-chargeability. You actually can get charged to their country. So an Indian guy married to a French woman would be charged to France, even though it's his employment-based case. Okay, so we have people who were born in Nepal and live in India. They have Indian passports, but they were born in Nepal. They're all charged to Nepal. Does that help?
Mm.
Okay.
I'm sorry, going to go back a little bit on the traveling question, because we have another one.
If you give me 5 minutes, I can give you the answer, but I need a 5 minute. I just need to look at my notes.
And of course, this is specifically for a cap gap, traveling on a cap gap. Yeah, so it's not so much about the H-1B. So if there's anything you'd like to speak to on that aspect.
Again, what is cap gap? So the idea is, this is something important to understand. If your work authorization, your OPT or STEM OPT extension ends after April 1st, is it on or after? Let's just go with after April 1st. You are entitled to an extension of your work authorization if your H-1B is selected in the lottery. Okay, so let's take a concrete example. Let's say that your OPT is expiring on May 15th. So that's after April 1st. But after May 15th, how can you work? And that's where STEM extension, the gap gap comes in. Gap gap says, if you have been selected in the lottery and you filed for an H-1 with a change of status request, we'll give you an extension to continue working till October 1st. So you go to your DSO and you get it stamped as your I-20 gets stamped as gap extension. Now, can you travel during the gap? It's the same rules that we discussed. There's no difference in the rules. Okay, so the rules stay the same. If you travel before the H-1 approval, certain things happen. If you travel after the approval and before October 1st, something happens. If you travel after October 1st, you're on H-1B. So it's different depending upon which stage you are at. But that you are on gap extension makes no difference in what we discussed earlier.
Okay, so it's the same process depending on what stage. Anything else that you think is necessary to add for any of these?
I'm trying to remember because something that just struck me. Basically, what is a gap extension? It's an extension of your F1. What if you don't have, would you have a visa for that? I have to double check that. I'm a little confused. I confuse myself now because sometimes you can overthink things. And I think I would want to double check that. Can you travel when your H-1 is pending, you're on gap? Let's say you have a visa. And what if you don't have a visa? You won't get a visa, I think. On gap, they won't give you a visa. I have to double check that. Guys, before you travel, check with your lawyers. That's the smart thing to do. Be sensitive. I cannot give you all the information because I don't remember most of it or some of it, but I can make you sensitive about certain pain points, certain areas where you need to watch out. And you already know that before you travel. But on top of that, it also depends upon the stage of your green card, your visa status. All of these things need to be looked at.
Speaking of like things that you need to watch out for, so this is, I think, more of a question I also have, given that I'm on an OPT status, is towards the end of your OPT period, say, and especially for people whose OPT is expiring before April, things that you should already be wary of, say, if you're looking to stay on longer, or how early in the OPT stage should you be starting the process of seeking out H-1B sponsors, etc., and just beginning that transition process to change of status.
Are you guys ready to be bored to tears? Because I'm going to talk about something that's extremely important, but it's also very boring. So first of all, if your OPT is expiring before April 1st, you will not be able to, this is let's structure this a little bit. So if it is expiring before April 1st, but less than 60 days before April 1st, that means you have the 60-day grace period. When you apply for an H-1B, you get selected, you apply for an H-1B, you will be allowed to stay in the United States, but you will not get gap extension. So in the 60 days, if your H-1B is applied, you can stay but not work. And you will not be able to work till October 1st, but you can stay till the H-1B is approved. I think you can stay all the way to October 1st. Again, I have to double check that. Why? Because there is a technical issue. Let's say my H-1B gets approved on August 1st. Can I still stay till October 1st? And I think we've had people do that. They've stayed back, but I'm doubtful of its legality. Why? Because technically you have no status for those days in between August 1st and October 1st. But the government routinely approves you with an I-94. So on October 1st, you're automatically back in status. It is one of those de minimis issues that cannot be planned for. It can happen. Okay. So before we do that, we need to be aware of the quota problem. That means if your F1 is expiring, your OPT is expiring before April 1st, more than 60 days before April 1st, you're not going to be able to go through the lottery smoothly. So you either have to be outside the United States when the lottery is applied, or you have to be another status, like another F1. So you go back to school, so that you can wait out the time and go to classes while your H-1B is being tried. But it's important to remember one thing. What if you could get into a quota exempt job? This is a very interesting area and made very complicated unnecessarily by the government. But I guess that's why we get paid, because if it's not complicated, then anybody can do it. The problem with quota exempt is, first of all, remember, it is not the employer who has to be quota exempt. It is the job that has to be quota exempt. Okay. So what is quota exempt job? When you are working for a non-profit research organization, remember, not just non-profit, but non-profit research. So for example, if our association here started a department where we had 3 guys doing research all day, or at least part of the day, we could claim that we are now a non-profit research organization. It doesn't have to be the entire organization, doesn't have to be devoted to research, but it is a non-profit research organization. And it might be a different 501 classification. I don't remember that also. We'll have to double check that. But the idea is non-profit research or government research, whether it is a federally owned government research facility or state-owned government research facility. Then we come to the next area where you can be quota exempt if you're an institution of higher learning. And if you look at the Education Act, the Higher Education Act, higher learning is not defined as master's degrees or PhDs, but anything beyond high school could be potentially, if I remember correctly, could be higher learning. So I had cases in which a high school was offering a diploma as a mechanic. We were able to classify that, I believe, as an institute of higher learning. On top of that, we have community college. We even have schools who are exempt. I have a school in North Carolina that we've been working with for over 10 years. They have an agreement with the local community colleges based upon which there is a student exchange. Community college students come to teach their students, high school students go to college to take advanced classes. That kind of an affiliation can make the school exempt, even though it's a high school, or not even a high school, it's a middle school. Okay, it makes them exempt. So it's a complicated area. Your employer might be exempt and your job might be exempt. Now, how can a job be exempt? So for example, let's say you work for a private clinic, but your job as a researcher is to gather data about kidney disease and send it to NIH. And that's like 51%, 52% of your job. We could claim that you are supporting an essential function of an exempt organization. Therefore, the job is exempt, even though you're working for a private employer. So be careful with that. Keep that in mind. Sometimes the job could be quota exempt. So H-1Bs, what should you look for? Look for quota exempt jobs.
And related to H-1B again, and I see again this is a recurring concern, is about income sources. Is it possible to diversify your income sources while on an H-1B visa? Because again, like this is something you should be very careful about before taking steps towards that direction. So it's good to have clarity.
I'm in litigation with the government on this point right now. We have a case pending where the government has moved to dismiss. They're holding one of our clients hostage because of suspected visa fraud because he owns stock in his own company. So the simple answer there is, for an H-1B to exist, there has to be an employer-employee relationship with your employer. I'm going to start first with that part, then we'll talk about what you can do on H-1B. Can you do your own business kind of deal? But so I had a case in California where MIT gave somebody $1 million and they had a small stake in the company. Our client, the individual, was the CEO of the company and had a bigger chunk of the company. And the rest they were going to, I guess they had other investors coming in. So they came to us, we started the H-1B, we made full disclosure to the government. That's an exceptionally brilliant scientist. He was working with Internet of Things, IoT guy. His PhD thesis was on IoT. And we set up his company in which he has substantial stake. But there are other people like the board of directors who can fire him. So there is a genuine employer-employee relationship. We did the first H-1B. I'm assuming that he's going great guns to now. Okay. So you could have a situation where you have a business idea, and if you had people or a board of directors who can fire you, make full disclosures to the government, hide nothing, I think you can do an H-1B that way. Doctors do it all the way, all the time. Physicians do it, like for national interest waiver, that's a little different, but physicians do it all the time. So the idea is to have your own practice and have somebody who's able to fire you. That's the bottom line. Okay. Now the question is, and I have a particularly persistent student who wants to make a lot of money, and he keeps asking me the same question in 7 different ways, hoping that I would change my answer. So his first question to me was, can I invest in the stock market? I said, sure. That's a passive investment. So when you invest in the stock market, you have no control over what you invested in. So it's not a violation of your H-1B. You're not working, right? You're just making money. That's fine. So what if I invest in a smaller company where I have more of a say? I said, well, then the government would look at you more suspiciously. But still, it's okay if you're not actively involved. So what if I'm day trading? I said, I think that's closer to a problem, because now all of a sudden you're churning stock, and they could consider that to be active work. Now remember, this is not written down anywhere. I do not know any place where USCIS has said one way or the other. These are just my conclusions based upon what I know about the law. Finally, we settled on understanding that passive investment is okay, where you're not doing anything to earn that money. But active investment, the closer you become to active investment, the more of a problem you could be in. And that is the H-1B story. Now, somebody called me again. Somebody was very concerned. And I had like 3 different emails from him saying, I've got $50 from the bank because they gave a finder's fee if you refer an account. I said, I don't think that's going to be a problem. That's like a passive income, because you just referred somebody and the bank gave you money. Do I report it? I said, yes, absolutely, you report it. But it is not, it's a de minimis problem. Don't worry about it. What if you got $10,000 selling something on eBay? I think that's a problem. Okay. So you know now what you can and cannot do, I hope.
As long as it can pass off as passive, you're likely to be in safer waters than actively going out and.
Don't say pass off. As long as it is.
It is passive. It is passive. But then again, this is not written anywhere. So open to interpretation, which is.
You can always blame me. Because see, what happens is, there's one good thing about United States, and I think it's true for all civilized countries. When you act upon advice of counsel, you are protected from an implication of willfulness. So nobody can say you did it knowingly, you did it, because immigration laws are complex. If a lawyer says it's okay and you do it, they can still take away some things from you, but they cannot throw the book at you because you acted upon advice of counsel. So in many cases, it's a good idea to get advice of counsel.
Thank you. I know it's a lot of information that you've been sharing, and I'm sure people will have a lot of clarificatory questions, but there's one particular question that I'd like to read out to you, because I think this is something that people are likely to encounter a lot in their student experience. Is, suppose you do apply for an OPT and your first application gets rejected, or you get an email saying that it's a minor technical glitch, so it's not that you're ineligible, but we request that you resubmit an application with the proper documentation or whatever may be the issue. Like in this case, the person says they submitted it with the wrong address. Instead of Dallas, it was Texas. So they reapplied for the OPT, and in the period that their second application was being processed, they got a receipt number for the first one. So now they have 2 OPT applications, and I'm sure they've written to the school and has requested a data fix. But how does a student proceed in this situation where you have 2 applications pending for the same visa status? Which one is
You've got to be a two-gun Tom on this one. You've got to hold one gun at your DSO and the other gun at the USCIS. So what do? You make a call to the USCIS, you put in a service request, follow it with a letter that I talked to you guys on this date. These are my receipt numbers. Please note that I've got 2 applications. The second one is the real one. The first one is kidding. Okay. So then you go back to the school with the second gun and tell the DSO, boom, boom, I've got a problem. Just want you to be aware of that. If there is any kind of inquiry from the USCIS, know that these two applications were put in under these circumstances. Preferably follow it up with an email. The more you have in writing, the better off you are.
So maintain a written record of all your communication is,
Always.
I would
I
say
also
that.
want I also want to remind people, this is a general rule, very, very important. Anybody here remember Comey? You remember Comey or no? Remember the FBI chief who got fired?
Oh, yes.
Okay. You remember how he used to keep notes of all his conversations? Why did he do that? Question for you.
I mean, in my training as a lawyer, it's that as long as you have everything on paper, it's verifiable proof. There is concrete proof of everything that's happened. So keep a paper.
Exactly. It's an exception to the hearsay rule. An exception to the hearsay rule when you have contemporaneous recording. So guys, whenever you talk to the USCIS or your DSO and they say something, come home, or better still, right there, type it out on your little, I don't know how your fingers move, those damn thumbs move faster than my thoughts do. Just type it out, the date, the time, and the content of the conversation. It doesn't have to be verbatim, but what were you told? Okay. So whenever USCIS tells you something, make a note of the date and the time and what they said. This is just a very good general rule anytime you ask your DSO or the USCIS for any information. Just remember, I just want you to remember that it's a good rule in this country because that's really considered to be evidence.
So maintain a paper trail or a written record of every communication. I'm going to digress a little bit from H-1B OPT and move on to something that is related in a way, which is the social security number. Now, how important is it to have an SSN already when you apply for either an H-1B or your STEM extension? Or is it okay that you've applied for one, it's pending, hasn't been issued to you, say for whatever reason, administrative delays or whatever it could be, but you still proceed with your application for your OPT or H-1B? Because I know that in the forms for these visas, they do ask you whether you have a social security number, and if not, would you like to simultaneously also apply for that along with your visa?
That's your answer. But on the H-1B side, a social security number is not required to apply. Because think about all these people who come from India. They don't have social security numbers, or other countries. They come with the approval, they land in the United States, they go to the Social Security office, apply for a number based upon their work authorization. Normally, I got my student work authorization in 1989, a couple of years back. And my authorization said, the Social Security number said, not valid for employment. I think a lot of students carry that, not valid for employment. Now, when you have that combined with your work authorizations, it becomes valid for employment. So Social Security number by itself is not determinative because you can always apply, but work authorization is determinative. You can get a Social Security number. In fact, we had a class action lawsuit against the Social Security Administration during the time Bobby Jindal was the chief, because they were creating all sorts of issues with issuing Social Security numbers. And the problem is that under the current rules of the SSA, I believe they cannot issue you a Social Security number unless you have work authorization or you can prove that you have a genuine non-work related need for a work authorization, for a Social Security number.
All right. And and I'm reading out one of the questions that we've received is someone is working unpaid on an F1 OPT and the OPT ends in July 2021, but the SSN application is still pending. So would they still be in a position to apply for a STEM extension?
This is such a tertiary level question. My answer as a lawyer would be, heck yeah, we can make it happen. Why should it be a problem? But what is the procedure for it? Beats the heck out of me. I've never dealt with it. But can we handle it? Yeah, absolutely. What is the problem? I mean, Social Security number is merely a number against which your taxes are paid. If there's a problem, we can always get a temporary tax identification number and later on combine it with the Social Security number.
So an SSN pending, I mean, you can still navigate that situation. It's not detrimental to your application.
Of course. Why not? I mean, what is so impossible about it? Why not?
Thank you.
See, the
And
good Lord also made courts for these kind of problems. If there is too much of an issue, we just walk it downtown and say, Judge, look at this. So
but I think the key is to try and avoid getting into litigation. But so I'm going to go back to something you started with, which is there's been a lot of movement administratively around immigration laws, and with the setting up of panels and committees to look into what the procedure is like and how they can simplify it. From your understanding and expertise, do you see the process or the time frame that it does take for people to get past that H1B or OPT approval stage, which can sometimes be a really long period? And there's no definitive like framework that within X amount of days you will have an answer. It's very circumstantial, and given COVID, I think those timeframes have only increased because there are administrative delays. But do you think that in the coming months there is a reasonable likelihood of it being a better, more streamlined process, and shorter durations or intervals of waiting periods that just makes it easier for you to be able to switch from one visa status to the other? Do you think that is something that's in the works with this administration?
I don't know this definitively. I saw Bernie Sanders' recommendations to the government because I think he was either chairing or he was a part of the committee who was giving recommendations to begin with about the laws. I know that there's a keen sensitivity towards the delays because the committee made that clear. Uh, can the Biden administration do something about it? Well, here's the easy fix. Make it possible to perform the activities of the status that you applied for before it is approved. So if I've applied for an F1, let me start going to school, damn it. Why am I sitting at home? Okay. Or if I've applied for an extension of an EAD as an H4 holder, let me continue working. What justification do you have that an I-485 person can continue working if their EAD is applied for up to 180 days, but an H4 EAD guy has to stop? Why? That is easy to fix. That's not that difficult. And if I don't think regulations should be needed for that. But let's say even if you have to do the regulations for that, the regulations could be just open for 15 days comment, notice and comment. It doesn't have to be all 60 days. So it can be a very abbreviated and quick regulation.
Okay.
It can be fixed, and it should be. And I think so. 2 points that I'm making is it can be fixed, and 2, there is sensitivity towards it.
Okay, great. So this is a very specific question, and I have no knowledge about this. So I'm going to just transfer it to you. This is someone who is, I think, currently working on an OPT status and has had the conversation with their company to get H1B sponsorship, but it's a startup, and their question is whether a company needs to be e-verified to qualify as someone that can sponsor your H1B visa.
Not at all. You do not have to be e-verified. I'm trying to remember what part of where do you have to be e-verified. I know that STEM OPT you've got to be e-verified, but H1B, no, there's no such requirement. Is there any part of H1B that requires e-verification? No, not a single part. And also remember, for H1B, it doesn't matter if you are a mom and pop joint just starting out or you have seed funding. It doesn't matter. All they have to be able to show is that they have a job for you. They don't have to show that they've got the money to pay you. That could go towards the credibility of having a job, but directly it's not relevant. So even small companies could do it. The smallest company for whom we have done an H1B was a one-employee company. The employer was basically, you can consider him the board of directors. So he was not involved in the company. There was only one W-2, one tax document showing that there was an employee, that single H1B. So that's not a problem.
Okay, another question just popped up, which is it okay to apply for passport renewal during your OPT or H1B application process? That should not be.
No problem at all. Remember, passport is the 4 lions, 3 you can see, the 4th one is in the back. The 4 lions are the domain of your government. That's India. That has nothing to do with USA. So you need that permission to, of course, stay in the United States. So what you do with that in the meantime is not an issue.
We're approaching the end of the session. So unless there's any particular questions that have not been answered, and I would request anyone that does have them to post it in the Q&A box. Anything else that that Rajiv ji, you would like to give us information on, you think is key or critical, anything that we should be on the lookout for in the news, or, just to sum it all up? I know there's a lot of information that's been shared, and I just want to say that the whole point of this is to just give people clarity, and this is not legal advice that we're giving you to be followed to the T. It's just I know it's very confusing, especially in the current circumstances, to navigate this system as an international student. So maybe just give a little bit more clarity into what it looks like to be on an H-1B, OPT status, or a green card applicant. And if there are any other questions, you're more than welcome to direct them to us or to Rajiv directly. And I'm going to type in all of the social media links so that you all have access to both the recordings as well as any further information we'll be sharing on this topic in particular. But yeah, I'm just going to ask if there are any questions that are still pending to be answered. I'm just going to take a quick look at the chat box. So, okay, someone has a very specific question about the current immigration bill about green card for PhD holders, and how feasible or likely do you think it is to pass in Congress?
Well, the thing is, remember, and I've said this before many times in many forums, the vision of the 2013 revision to the US immigration laws, 1,400 pages of condensed immigration law that I spent hours upon hours reading, and then it was not passed by the House. It was passed by the Senate. The vision of the 2013 legislation was all US students, international students, should walk out of the school with a green card stapled to their diploma. That was their vision. So they were making it really easy for all international students to get immediate green cards. Guys, this country is not doing you any favors, let me tell you this, because our population here is aging very, very rapidly. I wrote about the figures in one of my comments to Economic Times, that when you look at these figures, you realize to sustain Social Security, we need younger workers. So you have to pay for my old age. Please don't go away, hang in here. People need you, okay? So remember, the smarter people understand that we need a younger workforce. And it works for everyone. You get to live in this country and work here and create your dream vision without having to deal with any of the unnecessary baggage that you can have in other countries. And this country takes advantage and takes, you get to be our workhorses. So therefore, ultimately, if sanity prevails, which is not always necessarily true, you should be seeing a much better regard for talent for foreign students. So I think that's the direction we are headed.
So, I mean, of course, there's no definitive way of knowing what the outcome is, but it's a positive direction, you would say.
I'll tell you something. Many years ago, I helped write a law. It was the V visa. And I remember getting a call from the congressman's office who wrote that law. They couldn't figure out, they were in a hurry to find out. I mean, of course, you can always track the history of the law. They couldn't figure out where this law was proposed. And I reminded them that it was a part of the DC appropriations bill, because normally laws are proposed in different manners. So laws can be so complex and so weird that you think you have a winner and at the last moment it fails. So you never know until it is actually passed, signed, sealed, and delivered that the law has been passed. You can never, ever rely upon that.
No, I mean, I agree 100%. There's no certain way of knowing. And I think that brings us to the end of the session. I'm sure there are a couple of questions that have gone unanswered, and there are also a few that were answered earlier, but I think people joined at a much later stage. So just want to remind everyone that this event has been recorded, and we will be sharing the recordings so you can revisit these conversations. And if anything is still unclear, please do reach out. And again, this is just an information session, not legal advice or not concrete like advice. It's more, the purpose here is to just help international students students get a sense of what these processes look like and what it would mean for you to transition from one status to another. So thank you everyone for being with us, and especially thank you to Rajiv sir for answering all these questions so patiently and sharing all of your knowledge with us. And I hope we get the chance to speak with you soon, maybe on more issues that are of interest to you.
My pleasure. And hi, guys. Everybody take care. Don't worry too much about things. It'll all work out. Just temporary pains, like I said, labor pains of a new administration.